You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 25th of March 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, more than 1,000 people are arrested in Turkey as protesters angry at the jailing of President Erdogan's main opponent continue to take over the streets of Istanbul. Also coming up,
traditionally, ever since Anne Hidalgo came to power, that's been kind of the big political kind of dividing line between her and her opponents.
Paris votes to cut more car parking spots and to extend the number of pedestrianised streets. We'll ask if this will enforce or damage the legacy of Paris's mayor. Plus,
I'm not a big fan of The Atlantic. To me, it's a magazine that's going out of business. I think it's not much of a magazine, but I know nothing about it.
But we'll find out how a journalist from The Atlantic ended up in a group chat discussing top-secret US war plans. Plus, why would the wife of the US Vice President J.D. Vance go to a dog sled race in Greenland? Plus the papers, and we hear from a winner of one of the most prestigious literary awards on earth. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. The White House has confirmed that details of airstrikes carried out on Houthi rebels were texted to a journalist on a chat group before the attack took place. Russian state media says it'll release the results of yesterday's discussions with the US over a partial ceasefire in Ukraine later today. And the UN says it's reducing its presence in Gaza as a result of Israel's ongoing deadly strikes. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, last night marked the sixth night of discontent in Turkey as protesters gathered in Istanbul, angry at the jailing of the president's main opponent. The demonstrations in support of the city's detained Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, a man who was taken into custody last week on corruption charges. Well, as we go to air, an estimated 1,100 people have been arrested since Ekrem İmamoğlu's detention. To tell us more, I'm joined now on the line from Istanbul by the journalist Ayla Jean Yakli. A very good morning to you, Ayla.
Hi, Emma.
So this was the sixth night of discontent. Could you tell us what happened?
Yes. So protesters, tens of thousands of them, have been gathering outside of City Hall in central Istanbul to voice their opposition to the arrest of the city's popular mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu. He was taken into custody last Wednesday, and that has set off these nightly protests in Istanbul, which it's exceedingly rare for a public protest, especially of this size, in the last decade or so under Erdogan's very restrictive political environment that he's created here in Turkey.
So who is protesting exactly?
I was at the protest not last night, but the previous evening, and the people that I met were really quite young. They're in their 20s, maybe early 30s. These are people who have grown up with Erdogan. They don't remember another leader before Erdogan. He's been in power since 2003. And they come from a variety of backgrounds. Some of them were students. A lot of them were educated, were working as professionals, but there was a mix. And the things that they talked about were quite serious. Their concerns are about whether Turkey has a chance at remaining a democracy. They see the arrest of İmamoğlu as almost the last nail in the coffin of Turkish democracy.
Ekrem İmamoğlu has quite an astonishing ability to unite a deeply divided country, doesn't he? Because as Erdogan moves further and further away from a secular way of governing, İmamoğlu not only appeals to the secular side, but he also has managed to galvanise support from different parts of society, which ordinarily would support Erdogan, hasn't he?
Yes, that has made his political rise so successful. in this deeply divided society, he has been able to appeal to both religious conservatives, but as well as secular Turks. He appeals to Kurdish voters as well as nationalist voters. So these are very divided groups of people. They normally don't get along, but it's been essential for Imamoglu, and it's what made him such a formidable challenger to Erdogan. If he were able to consolidate such diverse groups, it, at least according to opinion polls, it showed him pulling far ahead of Erdogan.
And Erdogan, in response, has replied with very violent words, hasn't he? He says the protests have turned into a movement of violence, and says that protesters will feel ashamed for the evil that they have done to the country.
It's true. He has deemed these protests street terrorism and has repeatedly accused them of disrupting the country's peace and order over what amounts to thievery and corruption in the Istanbul municipality, basically telling protesters that they're misguided, that this isn't about an attack on democracy. This is them supporting a corrupt public official. That's effectively been his charge. You know, it indicates that he's not really hearing the main concerns of protesters. That might be because it's not getting through to him, or because he's turning a deaf ear to the fact that they're worried about Turkish democracy. But he hasn't shown any sign that he's of conciliation, that he's willing to reach out and work with these discontented voters.
So where does Erdogan turn now, given the fact that, as you said, he's not showing any signs of concession to the protesters? And indeed, internationally, he is emboldened by the arrival of Donald Trump, and also the fact that Turkey has a role of growing importance when it comes to what's happening in Ukraine with Russia. So he could dig in and clamp down now. Or alternatively, as you said at the beginning of this interview, these are new, fresh waves of protests that haven't been seen in Turkey for a very, very long time. So one wonders, how much of a threat does Erdogan face now?
Mm-hmm. Those are very key questions that, you know, the answers we'll see probably in the days and the weeks ahead. For now, the protests, even though they do eventually clear the area outside of City Hall, and in other cities where protests have occurred, they do use police force eventually, pepper spray, tear gas, and the like. They've detained more than 1,000 protesters, but they're still allowing these protests to take place at all, which is significant. In the past, they've been able to completely block off areas where people have tried to voice opposition to Erdogan. If these protests continue at this level, one important question is whether they're even allowed to continue to take place, whether the clampdown does become more severe, they arrest more people, they try to preemptively stop the protests. But the point that you made on the sort of geopolitics of all this is very significant. You know, the arrest of Imamoglu took place just days after Erdogan spoke with Trump by telephone in the first call that they had since Trump was inaugurated. And we don't know if the prospect of this arrest came up at all. It seems unlikely. But whatever they did discuss clearly made Erdogan feel confident enough in his relationship with the United States, which has been, there's been a lot of friction in it in the past. It made him feel confident enough that he could take what has been a political risk for him by arresting Imamoglu.
How easy or difficult, Tyler, is it to report on what's going on over there? I mean, there are reports that authorities jam the internet signal when you go down to the protests, but also that journalists are being detained, and there is a genuine fear that the accurate and transparent reporting of what is going on in Istanbul is going to be compromised.
Yes, I mean, the arrest of journalists, 10 of them were detained yesterday after raids on their house. That's deeply concerning and very, very worrying. These are people, I know some of them personally, these are people who are extremely dedicated and committed to covering Turkey as factually and as clearly as possible. Another big problem has been that most television stations and newspapers are very close to the government. They're either controlled outright by the government or run by companies that are close to Erdogan. They've largely been ignoring the protests unless they've depicted them, sometimes falsely, as causing damage, violating the grounds of a mosque, things like that. So there is both a combination of a blackout, but also a bit of, let's say, coloring what's happening in a very negative light. So for Turk's ability to access information, the arrest of the journalists, the refusal of most newspapers and TV stations to cover accurately the protests has debilitated people's ability to follow what's happening.
Hi, Jean Yackley. Thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. Now to Paris, where residents have made a landmark decision this past weekend that could transform how people move through the city's streets. In a referendum-style vote, Parisians backed a plan to pedestrianise 500 more streets. Monocle's editor-in-chief, Andrew Tuck, caught up with our Paris bureau chief, Simon Bouvier, to hear more about the move. Andrew began by asking Simon what exactly was at stake in this vote.
So this was the third of these votations citoyennes, which are a new type of referendum-style vote that City Hall here has pioneered under Mayor Anne Hidalgo. The first two were about more controversial topics, also linked to mobility. The first one famously was to ban the use of rental electric scooters. And the second one was to impose a special parking tax on SUVs. This third one was essentially an up or down vote on City Hall's plans to essentially green and pedestrianize 500 additional streets in Paris, and it passed by 66%.
We should just point out how many people voted. It's a very small turnout. Some 4% of people get to voted or decided to vote in this plebiscite, but they get to carry the day.
That's right, and there was similar criticism at the time when this electric scooter vote and this special parking tax on SUV votes took place. Even though that time it was 8%, this is approximately half that turnout. So only, as you were saying, 4% of registered voters, even though for the first time City Hall allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. So minors who were 16 and older were allowed to participate. And I guess mathematically that reduced turnout because more people were eligible and that particular demographic didn't turn out so much for this. So the main criticism from Hidalgo's political opponents is that essentially this was a kind of naked attempt by her to give her own plans some kind of democratic legitimacy when in fact very few people turned out to vote.
Now, there are already some 200, I believe, of these green lungs. This will bring in the total to 700. But now there's another bit of process because they haven't exactly decided which streets, it seems, to make pedestrian.
That's right, and I think that strengthens the hand of the kind of critics who say this is just an attempt to give a kind of democratic veneer to very vague plans. No specific streets have been identified, and nor has a cost estimate been provided for how much it's going to set taxpayers back to implement this. But they say that the details for this will emerge in the next 3 years, where they will set specific suggestions for which streets should be greened and pedestrianized. Just so that you have an idea, it amounts to roughly 4 to 8 streets per neighborhood. And on average, there are 3 to 4 neighborhoods per arrondissement. So it's actually quite a lot of streets.
And also some 10,000 parking spots to go. The traffic in the city has already been halved by many estimates, but this is going to make it more difficult to bring your car into the city because you won't find anywhere to park it. And I presume for some residents, this is going to cause some consternation as well.
Yes, and I think, there are always these special dispensations for residents and so on. It's more for people who need to drive through the city to get to work or for deliveries. It will make life for delivery drivers very complicated, even if they have kind of authorization to go into pedestrianized areas. There won't be much real estate for them to park their vehicles on, which will cause all sorts of issues. So I think that is traditionally, ever since Anne Hidalgo came to power, that's been kind of the big political kind of dividing line between her and her opponents, has been kind of pro-car versus anti-car. And one criticism that I think they're going to have to address is that the existing green spaces in the city. You mentioned there are over 200 pedestrianized and green streets and many parks and green areas in the city overall are already quite difficult to maintain. One of the signature policies of Hidalgo's second term was, one of the flashiest promises, I suppose, was, we're going to plant one new tree for every baby that's born in Paris during my second term. Well, that comes out to 170,000 trees in 6 years. That's more than 8 times the pace of the previous term. And meanwhile, the number of landscapers and lumberjacks that are employed by the city has gone down significantly since the 1990s. So squaring that circle of, yes, expanding the number of green spaces and pedestrianized areas to make it more and more pedestrian friendly and less polluted is something that clearly a lot of Parisians can get behind. But there is technical matter of how you're going to execute on that properly that they have not addressed so far.
Well, that's us doing our journalism bit, but now let's go off track a bit, because you're a tall gentleman with very long legs. You also have a baby, and you also stride around the city. So for someone like yourself, are you sympathetic with this kind of the way that we're travelling, as it were, and how we're changing Paris?
Well, I think it is absolutely clear to anybody who lives within the Paris city walls that their quality of life, if they're kind of the average Parisian, has improved tremendously when it comes to day-to-day living. As you said, walking around, not being in contact with fumes at every turn, because as you know, Paris's streets are very old, and many of them are very narrow and have kind of been adapted to modern life. They weren't designed for this heavy car traffic, right? You have all of these kind of great arteries and the Haussmannian boulevard and avenues, but many of the streets are not designed for that. So it really makes the air pollution, especially in some of the areas that are closest to the peripheric ring road, quite bad. So I think for most Parisians who don't rely on cars as their day-to-day transportation, it's been a tremendous improvement, including for me and my family, that's for sure.
Lastly, tell us, because I think we've gotten a few references to this fact, but we've opened a new office and bureau in the city. And actually, where we are, the shop and the cafe are on Rue Bachemont, that area is quite pedestrianised now. And indeed, some of the people who are guests at the party said, look, it's cool, we like it, but, it hasn't been without some controversy delivering this change. When you step out the front door of the bureau of an evening or at lunchtime, what's your sense of how people have adopted the street?
Well, I think that for people who live and work there, it's marvelous. And I guess the neighborhood of Montorgueil, where we have our Paris Monocle embassy, if you will, is one of the neighborhoods that was pedestrianized in the 1990s. So there's a kind of rhythm to life there. This village-like atmosphere has been created over decades. It's not something that is brand new and where there's a question mark over whether or not it's going to make a bigger difference, let's say, to the quality of life of the people who live there than it is going to be an annoyance to people who are used to driving through there. Here, that's how life is organized. So I think, yes, for delivery drivers and taxi drivers who are dropping off guests for our party, maybe it's not the easiest neighborhood to get around. But I do think that now it's part of the fabric of this particular neighborhood. And as unpopular as Hidalgo is for her kind of my way or the highway style of leadership, it's undeniable that since she came to Paris City Hall in 2014, the lifestyle and expectations even of Parisians have definitely evolved under her leadership. So although the question of how fast and how much of Paris should be pedestrianized is still an open one, I don't think there's any going back to a 100% pro-car policy. The idea that there was intense car traffic on the very banks of the Seine now for a lot of people seems like a bygone memory, and bringing that back is not something that's going to get any traction.
Well, who knew that pedestrian news could be so interesting, and that the city of the flaneur and the flan could come up trumps again? Let's go for a walk next time with Abby. You might have to wait for me because I think your stride is about double mine.
That was Monocle's Andrew Tuck and Simon Bouvier there on the referendum on the continuing change to Paris's streets. You're listening to Monocle Radio, still to come on today's programme.
Often in these kind of events, when the dust settles, that's when, things start shaking out and you start looking towards the future.
Our Istanbul correspondent Hannah Lucinda Smith will bring to life her special report from Syria from Monocle magazine's April issue. Stay tuned to The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Let's continue with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Inga Thordar, Chief External Relations Officer at the Oceanborn Foundation, former senior editor at BBC and CNN. Good morning. Nice to see you, Inga.
Nice to see you too. Good morning.
You just got back from Denmark, haven't you? And all eyes are on obviously how it's reacting to Greenland. I mean, you were at a Lenny Kravitz concert, so maybe we'll sort of leave Mr. Kravitz and his leather trousers to one side. But the fact was, were people talking an awful lot about what is happening in Greenland and the US? We'll hear from our foreign editor Alexis Self in a moment about it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a topic of conversation, and the Danes are very split. I mean, some are not worried about it at all, saying, Denmark is the autonomy of Greenland is absolute, and Denmark, has been, a good partner to them. That's the view of the part of the sort of Danish populations. The others are saying, well, Greenland should be able to decide on its own what it wants to do. And obviously the new government, they're coming in. But I mean, it sort of spills a little bit further. I mean, I did go to Iceland before I went to Denmark. And there are sort of movements there, like there's American oil tanker that arrived in Iceland to store oil for the future. There was a nuclear submarine, not with nuclear weapons, but that stopped in Iceland for refueling. So there's it feels like there's some ramping up in that sort of Arctic region of American activity. And I think that is worrying people a little bit.
Using it as a store cupboard. Let's have a look at the papers. I think it is one of those moments in journalism where your jaw hits the floor when you see the story. This unbelievable, absolute, in its most literal sense, story from Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, whose headline is "The Trump administration accidentally texted me its war plans." And this is how he was somehow invited onto an encrypted group chat called Signal. And then what unfolded? Tell us, Inga.
Well, yeah, he was apparently added by Mike Waltz, who is the National Security Advisor, to this group of, what seems like actually a lot of people when you know about the topic, of around 18 people who are discussing potential attacks on the Houthi rebels in Yemen, or who had been threatening attacks in the Suez. So, and the conversation is just what is most unbelievable, that this group would be discussing it, on Signal, which is not an approved method of discussing security matters, especially not attacks. Secondly, of course, that they just accidentally put someone on it that shouldn't have been on it, did not have the clearance to be on it. And then the language they used, but they basically, it unfolded before Mr. Goldberg's eyes, how they decided to, continue with the attacks that, of course, started mid-March.
It is so elegantly written from the man of a seasoned journalist who is cynical to the last, thinking, sorry, I've been stitched up here. Someone is trying to trap a journalist. To the point where he goes and sits in a supermarket car park in his car, having been sent the exact details of what the Americans are going to do over Yemen. And follows the events that he has been warned about actually happening in front of his eyes online. And this disbelief that he could actually find himself in such a macho group of communicators who effectively have their hands on, the Americans' military.
Yeah, that's correct. And the way that he writes the story and it unfolds, it sort of takes you on this journey, doesn't it, of him being totally incredulous that he would be on this journey, thinking that it was some kind of a hoax. Journalists often get, misinformation sent to them. And, and sitting there waiting for what the events that they said on the chat unfold. And then when it starts to unfold, he realizes what it is. And it's very difficult not to applaud his incredible integrity. I mean, first of all, to report it straight away. Secondly, he protects the identity of active intelligence officers that were named on the group. He doesn't reveal anything that could be seen as classified or of national security. And then, of course, he removes himself from the group when he realizes that this is real. So I think, Jeffrey Goldberg just showed a masterclass in good ethical journalism.
It has raised questions about the ethics of journalism now, and questions were being asked before we came on air, which is, if you were part of that group, how long would you stay on it? Or when would you absent yourself? Because he's obviously got to the point where he's post-attacks. Yeah. He's clearly realised where he is. He could sit on that group for the rest of the Trump administration. But what would he be able to do with the information?
Well, of course, you don't know how long that group would have kept going for, but the information that was on there right there was relevant at the time. So, of course, not reporting it in real time would probably have been questionable. So, in my view, he made exactly the right decision. And we can see the fallout from this. I mean, it has raised so many questions that the Trump administration is now going to have to answer. I mean, if this is how they treat issues of national security, if this is how they speak about their allies, if this is how they kind of decide on attacks. And let's not forget that these attacks have killed scores of people in Yemen. It does feel slightly strange that is done in this way, and then that the attacks are greeted with emojis, as most of these people on the group did.
Big fists, American flag and fire. And what's also is that they sort of have a really good go at Europe. J.D. Vance, I hate bailing Europe out again. Pete Hegseth, I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. It's pathetic. I mean, the fact that you said that the Trump administration is going to have questions that it needs to answer. Not for one moment do I actually believe that they shall. You get the impression that this will just be brushed under the carpet and whatever needs to happen will happen behind closed doors. But there will be no show or demonstration that the democratic process is going to have slightly tighter checks on it from within the White House.
No, I mean, of course, the calls from the Democrats have already come in of, both of resignations, of further investigations into what happened. I think that the perhaps the most serious thing, and this is what sort of some of the papers are raising, is that there could have been a possible breach of law, including the Espionage Act, etc. And I think that they will probably they won't get away with not looking into that. But I do think it shows that the people that Trump hired were not seasoned professionals in these areas, and that inexperience and just cavalier attitude to running the country is very evident on this group. I think some of the language you talk about, like the Europeans, I mean, I don't think that they were surprised at that, but it's just unbecoming, I guess.
Let's move on to one final story that you wanted to draw our attention to, which is in The Guardian today about Swedish shoppers boycotting supermarkets because food prices have gone up. And there is the perennially excellent and amusing picture of the pick and mix, which has the chocolate bar called Plop, which is always raises a smile. This is a genuine problem, though, isn't it? That people are not shopping because of prices.
Yeah, I mean, the price of food has been going up, and it's been leading to some consumers in Sweden voting on their feet. What it basically is about is that they believe that the big supermarkets are profiting, so they're raising the prices more than they have to increase their profit margins. So they are asking this campaign is asking people to not shop in the big supermarkets, but rather go for locally produced food, go for smaller shops with less profit margins. It's, of course, not new. It's been sort of around Europe. The same thing has been going on. And, I mean, we can feel it in every country, the price of food going up. But it is interesting that, it started off with somebody who was very unhappy about the price of chocolate crisps and coffee.
Inga Thordar, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. The time here in London is just nudging at 7:30 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A look now at some of the other stories we're following today. The White House has confirmed that details of airstrikes carried out on Houthi rebels were texted to a journalist on a chat group before the attack took place. The editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, says he received an invite on the encrypted messaging app Signal from an account labelled White House National Security Advisor Michael Waltz. He then watched as highly confidential information was posted on the chat. Russian state media says it'll release the results of yesterday's discussion with the US over a partial ceasefire in Ukraine later today. 12 hours of talks were held in the Saudi capital, Riyadh. And the UN says it's reducing its presence in Gaza as a result of Israel's ongoing deadly strikes. A UN employee was killed last week in an attack. Israel has denied it was behind the strike. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, let's have a look at some of the other stories we're following today. Here's Monocle's foreign editor, Alexis Self, who looks ahead to the Second Lady of the US leading a delegation to Greenland later this week.
The news that Usher Vance, the Second Lady of the United States, will lead a US delegation to Greenland on Thursday has been greeted angrily by the nation's leaders, who are still reeling following Donald Trump's claimed intention to annex the island.
Hello. I'm so excited to share that I'll be visiting Kalaalleq, Greenland, next weekend.
In a dead-eyed address on her official Instagram account, Mrs. Vance declared her excitement at having the opportunity to attend Greenland's national dog sled race, which is sponsored by the US consulate. Among her entourage will be White House National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and US Energy Secretary Chris Wright, both also apparent avid dog sled fans. But Greenlandic Prime Minister Mute Egede has attributed less fluffy motives to the trip. On Monday, Egede told a national newspaper that the new US administration is completely and utterly indifferent to Greenland's sovereignty, and that it is only interested in taking over our country over our heads. Temperatures in Sisimiut, the town hosting the dog sled race, hover around -5 degrees Celsius at this time of year. The mercury could drop even lower if the US delegation finds itself in the same room as Greenland's leaders.
That was Alexis Self, our foreign editor. For more from Monocle's editors and correspondents, sign up for our free daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute, at monocle.com/minute. 14:33 in Jakarta, 7:33 a.m. here in London. Now, protests have erupted across Indonesia following Parliament's unanimous approval of military law amendments. The revised law allows active military personnel to hold more civilian positions, raising concerns about a return to military influence in government. I'm joined now by Andreas Harsono, who's from Human Rights Watch, a senior researcher on Indonesia. He joins me on the line from Jakarta. Good afternoon, Andreas.
Hi, good afternoon.
So what kind of legal changes were made?
There are 3 articles that are being changed. One is to expand the involvement of military officers from 10 to 15 ministries and agencies. Second is to make retirement age to be longer for military officers. And the third is to let the president decide on the so-called non-military operation. In the past, it should be approved by the parliament, but now it is only based on the presidential order.
Now, you've been working for Human Rights Watch on Indonesia since 2008. So just in your experience, how big a change is this?
It should be big. It will make military impunity to be bigger. The role of the military, let's say, in the Attorney General office, in the past, they are not there. Now they are involved in the public prosecution office. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, under a different law, the military tribunal law, any officer who is involved in a crime, rape or stealing or murder, they cannot be tried in a general jurisdiction court. They should be tried in a military court. Meanwhile, the military prosecutor and the military judges, they also have to answer to their commanders. There are a lot of contradiction, dualism in this military dealing with civilian affairs. I'm really concerned because it means that impunity is going to be much more difficult for the military officers.
Has there been any opposition to this apart from the demonstrations on the street, given the fact that I understand Parliament approved these changes unanimously?
There was some compromise made between the major opposition party and the ruling coalition. For instance, the scale of the military involvement was reduced from what the president had initially proposed. But among the NGOs, among student, younger generation, they think that this is overblown. This is too much, that the military is going back to be, in power, just like what the military under then President Suharto for 3 decades since the end of the Cold War. No?
And just explain to us how Indonesians have reacted to this, given the fact that it has happened, unanimously. There are protests, but they seem to be limited to certain groups of society. Is there a general feeling of unease about this, or Indonesians accepting what is happening?
The younger generation, they are very angry. They thought that it was made without proper public consultation. It was rushed. It was done mostly behind closed doors. In fact, it was done not in the parliament building. They rented a hotel nearby to do the meeting, without usual public scrutiny, without usual, for instance, live TV parliament coverage like usual if you do any session in the parliament building. So people are angry, and the protest still going on until today from city to city, more than 30 cities already over the last how many days? Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, 6 days already. And of course, there are many injuries among the protesters. Many are beaten, bleeding. Some were detained by the police. And also among the police officer, anti-riot police officer, many of them were also injured during the stone throwing, tire being burned. The situation is pretty bad. And then the economy is also showing recklessness with this new administration policy, including this one.
Andreas Harsono, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Jakarta. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Now, Monocle magazine's April issue is out this week with its lead feature from Hannah Lucinda Smith, Monocle's Istanbul correspondent, following her return from Syria. She caught up with Monocle's Chris Lord to discuss her report on the state of Syria today and the idea that first brought her out there.
Well, I think generally as a journalist, I always think when something big happens, you either want to be there at the very beginning, or you want to leave it a bit and wait until all the other journalists have gone and then go. Because, Assad fell and the world's media piled in and everyone's kind of chasing the same stories. And of course, it's a very exciting and important time. But often in these kind of events, when the dust settles, that's when, things start shaking out and you start looking towards the future. And the big question for me with Syria is not only the political rebuilding that needs to be done, but the physical rebuilding. The level of destruction in the country it's absolutely huge. Huge is too small a word for it. You've got entire districts, entire towns completely destroyed. And in fact, it's not just in Syria. I feel like over the past decade, I've just reported from place after place that has been reduced to rubble. I've almost sort of run out of words and phrases to describe the wholesale destruction of places from, even in eastern Turkey, Ukraine, Syria, just everywhere destruction. And so I was really, really interested in coming at this moment where the world's attention had kind of not completely turned away, but certainly the journalists are kind of left again. Things are settling down a bit. People are sort of adjusting to this new reality in Syria. and thinking about the future and thinking about how they're going to rebuild. The other thing that kind of drew my interest as well is I got a couple of notices from friends in Turkey about construction events that were happening in Syria. And I was amazed at how quickly they'd been organised. There was one called Buildex, which actually I profile in the article, which is a Syrian-run construction fair. And then there are also Turkish construction fairs going on as well. And it became very, very clear when I started kind of ringing people that, the Turkish constructors were just going to be, absolutely leading the pack when it came to foreign investment piling in.
That's it, though, Hannah, isn't it? That's right, because Turkey, has obviously backed the rebels for many years throughout the fight against the Assad regime. And in fact, you talk about the kind of age of rubble that we live in, and the fact that, so many conflicts around the world that you've reported on, as you say, from eastern Turkey and elsewhere, great urban decimation has happened in these places. But actually, what strikes me in this story is when you get to Syria and you come in on one of the Turkish Airlines flights that have only in recent months, started flying between Istanbul and Damascus. There's actually an amazingly hopeful moment, isn't there, where families are returning for the first time after many years, I suppose, living in exile or as refugees overseas.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that I love about doing this job is that your expectations and your prejudices are constantly confounded. I think, like a lot of people, when the regime changed in Syria, obviously it goes without saying Bashar al-Assad was a terrible president. He did terrible things. His regime did terrible things. But of course, the administration that's come in his place also have done terrible things in the areas that they controlled. Obviously, they have a past in Al-Qaeda. And so I was, one of those people who was sort of thinking, okay, Assad's gone, but what comes next? And at the moment when that plane landed, the plane that I took from Istanbul, it was mostly almost entirely full of Syrians who were going home for the first time. And the sheer joy that erupted when that plane hit the tarmac, people were singing, people were crying, people were applauding. It was one of those moments where I sort of rearranged what I thought, because we can talk about the politics, we can talk about the future, we can talk about the pros and cons, but the reality is Syria is a country where more than half of the population has been displaced. There are millions of Syrians, including close friends of mine, who never thought that they would see Damascus again. They never thought they would go home again. And for them to be able to do that and witnessing that was something really, really affecting for me.
You talk when you get in the piece, once you get on the ground in Damascus, first of all, what comes across is a sense of the scale of destruction that has happened, certainly in the suburbs, sort of away from the old city. You talk about these kind of, really leveled neighborhoods that people are now returning to, and they're coming back, frankly, with diggers and with bulldozers and with sort of a plan, if you like, tentative still, because these people are still sort of picking up the pieces, but a plan to rebuild. Did you, in the course of the days that you were out there for us, did you leave sort of hopeful? What was the sort of takeaways in terms of what the road ahead looks like? Does this seem like there is a sort of spark of hope that people are still hanging on to at the end of that regime? Or did you leave kind of feeling, actually, there is a sort of consensus here among Syrians of the need to kind of put aside some old differences and push on ahead with this rebuild?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can hold like two ideas in your head at the same time about this. And most of the Syrians in Damascus that I spoke to were incredibly pleased that Assad has gone. I didn't speak to a single person who expressed any regret about it. I'm sure that those who are in any way regretful are keeping quiet at the moment. But at the same time, those same people who are happy that Assad is gone also expressed reservations about the new government, sometimes fears about the new government, particularly people who are from minority groups, or even Sunni Muslims who have a kind of more liberal lifestyle. There are plenty of Sunni Muslims, particularly in Damascus, who drink alcohol, who live a very sort of liberal lifestyle. And they're very, very concerned about what might come in the future. They look at places like Afghanistan, where, the Taliban came in 2021 and promised to, sort of have reformed and to be more moderate. And then, of course, they weren't at all. They went back to what they always have been. So, yeah, I think there's these sort of two almost conflicting feelings. What a lot of people said to me was, okay, this new regime, it's not ideal. We are worried about what they might turn into. However, at the moment, we've got absolutely nothing else to work with.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
It's 14:45 in Bangkok, 7:45 a.m. here in London. Time now for an Asia Pacific news roundup. Monocle's Asia editor based in Bangkok is James Chambers, and he joins me now. James, thank you so much for joining us. You're in Bangkok, and so is the Motor Show.
Yes, that's right. I thought we'd go on a little jaunt around Asia's trade fairs, conference centres, exhibition centres and ballrooms today, starting here in Bangkok, where the Bangkok International Motor Show gets underway this week. It's an annual thing. Some of our listeners may not know that Thailand is actually a huge automotive market. It's the biggest in Southeast Asia, especially in terms of manufacturing. A lot of the big car makers produce their cars here. So this is a huge event in the calendar. And I guess the headline news is that car sales in Thailand in the domestic market have been plummeting over the last 2 years. And this year has got off to a pretty bad start as well. So of the 41 or so car companies that will be showing at the fair, there are going to be many, many, many promotions on offer. And there are some ridiculous deals if you're in the market for a car.
What's gone wrong with the motor market where you are?
Well, it's not specifically, I guess, the motoring industry or demand for cars, but that's just an indication of consumer sentiment here in Thailand. Household debt, by some measures, is now over 104% of GDP here, which is a huge figure for Thailand. And people, under so much debt, aren't obviously spending. So the government is trying to come up with many ways of trying to alleviate that debt burden so that people can get back to buying things. But it doesn't seem to be working as of yet. And that's having a major impact on things like cars, because most people here would take out a car loan to buy a vehicle, and the banks have started saying no and making it very difficult to get credit.
Now, looking at those who are on show at the Bangkok International Motor Show, we've got at least 50 brands showing. 15 of them are from China.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the Japan, car companies from Japan have dominated this region, not just Thailand, but Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, for the last 30 or 40 years. But the big story here, as with the rest of the world these days, is the arrival of the big Chinese car makers, and particularly the EVs. The streets of Bangkok these days are awash with Chinese cars. BYD is obviously the biggest, but you see many others like Great Wall and Geely. And Thai people do seem to be taking to EVs. But we talk about the competition a lot between China and the rest of the world, between BYD and Tesla. But actually, the fiercest battle is between the Chinese car makers themselves. I mean, you hear all these stories about how BYD is trying to kind of push out its Chinese rivals, and those are the car makers that they see as their rivals. So even though it's often portrayed as China versus the world, the fierce battle when it comes to promotions and sales is amongst themselves as well.
You said we were going around to spin around the trade fairs. It's not exactly a trade fair, but it's a beautiful fair nonetheless. We're going to Hong Kong now for Art Basel.
Well, yes, Art Basel Hong Kong is the biggest art fair in Asia. It is a huge deal for the art world in this part of the world. It's a magnet for everyone who works in art, from Thailand to the Philippines to Singapore to Korea to Japan. Everyone flies in to Hong Kong for this. And there's a feeling that it's not just a Hong Kong art fair. It's an art fair for the region. So every country might have its own fair, but nothing is as global as Art Basel Hong Kong, and it's the by far the biggest, and it's everyone's traveling there right now. I I was tactical and went to Hong Kong last week to see the city before everyone arrived and talk to some people. And you could feel the city gearing up for this big event. But what was quite interesting is actually it was quite quiet last week, and there wasn't much of a buzz at all. And actually, it's going to be completely different now as everybody flies in. And if you just look at the hotel prices, I was talking with the GM of the Upper House, which is one of the best hotels on Hong Kong Island, and their rates for tonight will be about 4,000 euros, which is crazy. So you'd be lucky to get a room there, and if you do, you have to pay 4,000 euros for it.
You've been dashing backwards and forth from Jakarta, haven't you, in anticipation of the Chiefs Conference, which we're holding next month?
Yes, by far the biggest event in Asia over the next few weeks. The one that everyone's talking about is our very own conference that's happening in Jakarta almost a month from today. We'll be in town on the 23rd and 24th and 25th of April for the 4th edition of the Chiefs. And this is our business and leadership conference. It's the 4th time we've done it. It started off in St. Moritz and Dallas, but last year it was in Hong Kong, and this year it's staying in Asia, in Jakarta, which is extremely exciting because Jakarta is one of those funny cities where it's a huge player. I mean, it's a big deal. There's like 30 million people. It's the gateway to the largest country in the region. It's got a huge economy, but actually not a lot of people have been there unless they've had to go there for business, because it's just not on the tourist trail. It's not like a Bangkok or a Tokyo. You either go there for business or you tend to pass it by. So we've seen a lot of interest in people who wanted to go and just needed, I guess, that excuse, and then that they're using the Chiefs as their opportunity to actually go and see Jakarta for themselves. And so we're very excited to be there hosting them.
James Chambers, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Bangkok. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Finally, on today's programme, the Windham-Campbell Prize is a pure celebration of extraordinary writing given to a tiny handful of the world's best novelists, non-fiction authors, playwrights and poets. Well, last night, 8 recipients received the award of $175,000 each. One of them is one of Britain's finest playwrights, Roy Williams, whose plays include the Death of England series, co-written with Clint Dyer, and the Lonely Londoners. Roy, you join me now. A very good morning to you and the warmest of congratulations to you.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you. Yeah, it's an absolute thrill and an honour to receive this. It's great.
I bet it was. How did you find out?
They emailed me about 3 or 4 weeks ago. I was going home on a train, just checking my emails, and it flashed up, from Michael Kelleher, who's the administrator of the award at Yale, based at Yale University in Connecticut, in the United States. And he said, can we get in touch, please, Roy? Because I've got some news for you. And I wondered, well, what on earth is that? And then I saw the link, Windham-Campbell Prize. And then I remembered a friend of mine who's a playwright as well, Winston Pinnock. She won the award 3 or 4 years ago. So it rang a bell. And then we went on Zoom. I spoke to Michael, and then he gave me the amazing news that I've been this year's recipient. The interesting thing about it is you never know you've been nominated until you win. So all of this was going on behind my back for God knows how long. People I must have been on someone's shortlist or something, and then it just whittled down to me and the other lucky 7 recipients. So it's been fantastic. Yeah, it's been really, really great. A wonderful bit of news for me.
And again, a warmest of congratulations. The nice thing about the Windham-Campbell Prize is it's not just for one work, is it? It just celebrates you and your entire body of work.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's recognised as body work, and I can't think of any better incentive than that, just to kind of keep going. It gives you it's a nice, generous money they offer to you, and it just gives you security. You don't have to worry too much about money for a period of time, and you just get on with what you want to do, which is writing, obviously. So it could be working on your next novel, an idea for another play, and what have you. And that's what every playwright, I would say, almost every writer wants to hear. We all cherish those moments where we can, spend time doing the thing we love, and not having to worry about, how am I going to pay next month's bill or something, or next month's rent, and so on. So it's really, it's an amazing award with a fantastic history.
Because it is one of the most generous prizes you can win, and $175,000 is no mean sum. And does it genuinely win you that time and freedom? And you've spoken to friends and colleagues who've won it before. I mean, how life-changing is it?
For a period of time, it is pretty much, I would say. I mean, obviously not lifetime, not forever, but for a period of time, like as I said, is what we all writers, so many writers, we cherish that. We get it with some. We all go into this life as writers, knowing that it's not exactly what you call a career. It's a way of life, I would say, to be a writer, and you buy into that, you accept that, and there are sacrifices along the way, but amazing awards such as this, it just gives you time to just go, don't worry about whatever. Here you go. Take your time, do what you're doing, and you'll be rewarded. And that's really most important. Someone's telling you what you're doing is good. Your instincts, the way you live, and wanting to be a writer are absolutely bang on. It's and it's really refreshing to hear that from for such amazing, generous people who are giving you this time and award.
And also, quite bizarrely, you actually get paid to do your job. The interesting thing is one wonders now how that changes your approach now that you have this freedom. What doors this now opens to you creatively?
Oh, it gives me time to think about, okay, that one idea. I always kind of thought, oh, you know what? If I ever had time, that's going to be my next project. That's going to be my next play or whatever. And you're going to think, so you can choose that. You can just say, okay, now finally, I can set some time aside, 3 or 4 months, or or however long it will take to focus on that. It's as simple as that, really. But it's absolutely it's so significant and glorious.
I'm going to ask you what that one idea is.
Well, I've got more than one. Yes, I do need to kind of have a proper think about it. It's an idea for one play, and it's also time to kind of there's another play that I've already written that I want to spend some time rewriting because it's not quite there yet. And this award such as this gives me that time. I can now finally say, okay, I can put aside 3 or 4 months to focus on that project and not necessarily worry about everything else. So it's great. It's fantastic.
Roy Williams, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers Laura Kramer, Tom Webb and Rima Takahashi. Our researcher was Francesca Jilks and our studio manager was Lily Austin, with editing assistance from Steph Chungu. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.